Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Jean-Michel Jarre, Oxymore. I gotta say, it's really something that Jean-Michel Jarre is still going strong in 2022. I can't imagine any regular viewers of this channel need an introduction to this legendary synth pioneer. I've already reviewed every single one of his previous studio albums, and the link to my discography review can be found in the description. Obviously, the guy's been at it since the mid-70s, transformed the world of electronic music as we know it with his early work, and continued to do his best to keep forging new paths for himself, trying new things, staying relevant to the times all the way up to present day. While he's absolutely not the most consistent of artists and has his share of disappointments or perhaps experiments that didn't pan out, he can always be counted on to deliver something that'll be interesting to talk about. And honestly, even most of his misses aren't that bad, and I'd generally be willing to defend in some way. I do absolutely have my fair share of hot takes on his catalog, mostly stemming from the fact that I tend to prefer the albums where Jarre goes out on a limb and tries something way out of his comfort zone over the ones where he sticks to his typical signature style of big bombastic synth arrangements that he's most well known for. But point is, I'm always going to be looking forward to a new project he comes out with. You never really know what to expect out of a new project from him at this point. Over all these decades, he's made so many different left and right turns. This latest one, Oxymore, did absolutely seem like it was being treated more like a big event from him than his previous album from last year, Amazonia. That was a fairly low-key and low-stakes ambient project that may not have sounded quite like anything else in his catalog, and did show him really delving into incorporating binaural audio and making like a 3D headphone experience. Sounded great, although I haven't felt compelled to come back to it once since making my video on it. This newest album was also treating the whole binaural audio thing as a big selling point as well. He was saying things like, oh, the future is immersive sonic worlds and metaverses. Yeah, that was inevitable. He was always one of the first artists I would have expected to jump on that whole bandwagon. I'm honestly more surprised it took him this long. At least he's saving the NFT talk exclusively for people rich enough to afford that shit and not actively promoting that side of things for the general public, so I'll gloss over that. For regular people, he's just focusing on the 3D audio stuff. Though he's not putting out, like, standard and binaural versions on the usual streaming services like he did for Amazonia to directly show the difference to people. He just has one standard version, which sounds like it's using those binaural techniques anyway. Though stylistically, this sounded like it was going to be a bit more upbeat. I heard a little bit of the lead single BRUTALISM when this was first announced, and I thought, oh nice, so he's going back in a bit more of an EDM-ish direction, I guess. It was nice, it was danceable, kind of reminded me of more recent cuts he's done, like Herbalizer, could be fun. But absolutely none of that could have possibly prepared me for the album itself once it actually dropped. I don't make this statement lightly, but Oxymore is almost certainly the single most experimental studio album Jarre has released to date. See, this album, in addition to being Jarre's latest excursion into more modern dance music styles, it's also a tribute to the late musique concrète composer Pierre Henry. Jarre looked up to him as one of the true pioneers of French electronic music well before it saw any kind of mainstream audience and was one of his earliest inspirations. The two were even going to collaborate together, though Henry passed away in 2017 and it never came to be. Although I'm told some minor bits left over from the work they did together ended up getting incorporated into this album instead. And Jarre being so directly inspired to pay homage to this musique concrète artist results in his most out there, abstract, and obtuse sets of tracks I've heard from him. All these pieces do generally have coherent techno beats, but flow all over the place in formless blobs with all sorts of strange sound effects surrounding your head in such a surreal way. Technically not musique concrète, since Jarre makes his music using pretty much all digital methods, and actual musique concrète requires tape manipulation. But you can still definitely hear that influence coming through in the structuring, or complete lack thereof. And it's not the kind of thing I ever would have guessed was Jarre from a distance either. There's little to no focus on his typical bombastic melodies or usual synth arrangements. No attempts at hooks or anything resembling pop appeal. It's pure experimental techno and doing its best to focus on its futuristic, high-detail sound design above all else. And did I mention that this guy's 74 years old? You never get left hooks of this caliber from artists who've been around as long as Jarre has. The fact that he's still willing to put something like this out at his age is something to be admired in and of itself. I thought it was impressive enough that he could get a clever reinterpretation of his classic Oxygen that lived up to that album's standards for me in Oxygen 3, and I also thought it was cool that Amazonia was able to stand with its own identity that no other albums in his 50-plus year long career really had, but I never would have expected him to go this far afield of his usual sound. Nobody can say that he isn't taking risks or that he's lost his edge. God damn. Now, granted, this album being his most experimental doesn't necessarily directly translate to personal enjoyment. While I was kind of mind-blown by this album when I first heard it and couldn't believe we were getting something this weird out of Jarre in 2022, I also had no idea what to make of it or how to feel about it, and it has not been an easy one to digest or pin down my feelings on. I'll admit, as I've been sitting with it over the past couple of days and the initial shock of the new sound wore off, it has kinda had me tuning out every now and then, or feeling like the experience was running together a bit too much. I also probably shouldn't oversell the weirdness of this album too much. This isn't, like, completely unlike anything I've ever heard before, or some brand new revolutionary idea. We're not operating on Outakar levels here, or delving into, like, actual traditional musique concrète. While there's not as much focus on melody as Jarre albums typically have, it's not like they're ever completely abandoned, and everything's being held together by those techno beats, which are fairly standard. Let's not forget that I mistook the lead single for a regular old EDM track from a distance when I first heard that little preview of it. Though at the same time, while I've heard similar albums to this one, I don't know if there's any single one that I could pin down that, like, it sounds just like. An artist like Tipper might be the closest parallel I can make, but this album is made out of different ingredients and is marginally more straightforward than that guy's work. My initial reactions made parallels to Silent Stereo Black Dog or Alex Smoke, even though it's not nearly as straightforward as those artists tend to be either. Ben Lucas Boyson's work under the Heck alias came to mind as well, even though it's not quite as dark or serious. It's kind of in that ballpark, but also not quite like any of those either. It's very much trying to be its own thing. An odd combination that brings the ideas of the distant past and the present together, as Jarre tends to like doing. Certainly as the album starts with the intro Agora, it feels like it's adhering to some ideas we've heard from Jarre before, the way it hard pans completely different field recordings to both ears and shoves in various vocal snippets and filtered French narration that seem to float around your head as they glitch themselves up. This intro reminds me a lot of the way he started his Arrow compilation. But as we go into the title track, something feels markedly different already with these crashing hip-hop-ish horn stabs and various odd synth lines ascending and descending and creating lots of menacing effects that all add up to a markedly darker sound than I'm used to out of Jarre. And the way it so quickly slips into this kinda glitch-hop-ish beat with all sorts of waves of bass, distorted synth effects, and incomprehensible vocal chops just feels like it's bouncing around every which way with not much in the way of structure, even though it still feels fairly driving. There's various sidetracks into trance synth progressions and even a key change at one point. It's nothing short of bizarre, and this is one of the most normal and cohesively structured tracks in the track listing, as is the following track, Neon Lips, which is mostly underpinned by some fairly driving synth arpeggios and techno beats that start and stop, and is able to use all of these elements to structure itself pretty well. Still feels like it's aiming to be a techno cut above all else, but still has plenty of odd moments where the track seems to abruptly stop and get sidetracked into ambient buildups that seem weirdly disconnected from other parts of the track, complete with sound effects that sound like someone's running a stick over a chain link fence. But from here, it feels like Jarre just kinda decides to give up on regular techno structures altogether for a while with tracks like Sonic Land, that just seems to jump from sound to sound and idea to idea without any real sense of guiding direction. Starting off with a slightly off-putting ambient pad joined by various detuned guitar plucks, building into pizzicato string sections and little violin licks, adding in more glitching effects, menacing bass, vocal chops, sounding like it's about to change key but instead abruptly pays off into a more up-tempo techno drop, switching into completely different patterns of beats and arpeggios, and you just never know where any of it is going to take you next. When I first heard this track in particular, I knew I was going to be in for a challenging listen, that I was going to need extra time to figure out how I felt. It was so damn strange and freeform, and Even if none of the sounds themselves were all that strange on their own, I could barely process what I was even hearing due to the complete lack of structure and wild unpredictability. After enough listens, I think I'd still probably mark it as one of the higher points, since it does a good job of keeping my attention the whole time, but this was always the point in the album where I would most frequently feel like I got lost entirely. Other tracks from here are just as abstract and freeform and can switch off from ideas that are really cool to other ideas that maybe don't interest me as much. Animal Genesis wasn't all that striking to me in its opening moments, with its fake whirring engine noises, ticking clock-like percussion, and widespread mechanical clattering that occasionally takes a break for field recordings of birds flying away. Honestly, I wouldn't even notice I was in a new track during this stretch. But at one point, it abruptly shifts into this completely unrelated dramatic synth progression alongside airy pads that I suppose feel like a bit more of the traditional Jarre sound, going over the previously established mix of mechanical stomping, and there's a few random piano breakdowns in there too, and the ending has all these strange mixes of light jazz percussion. This is a track that would really stick out to me as a high point if I was able to sit up and pay attention to it, though for every listen I had where it was a big highlight, there was another where I'd accidentally tune it out and it all blended into the surrounding sea of weird experimentalism without me even noticing. A track like Synthy Sisters feels like it should be a welcome breather, with these vocal chops and synth organs forming more of a coherent tune than the vast majority of the tracks on this thing. Although the tune itself is rather unpleasant despite being mostly major key and doesn't grab me as much as I'd hope, before all of it gets buried in seas of other clattering percussion. Sex in the Machine is another moment that feels like it's able to structure itself better than other moments here, mostly being driven by some squelching acid bass stabs, pattering 80s-ish percussion patterns that build up and pay off in pretty satisfying ways. Not to get into the out-of-nowhere bursts of bright synth chords and layers of clattering seashell-ish sound effects, which themselves appeared on a few different tracks here. This is one of the few tracks here which doesn't feel like it's randomly shifting you into something completely unrelated on a dime. Anytime there's a slight sidetrack into some barely present plinky bells or some other ambient sounds, it'll shift back into the driving groove it established before. At least aside from the outro with all those creepy pianos that's not quite as well connected to the rest of it, but still cool. But meanwhile, you get a track like Zeitgeist, which feels like a direct continuation of the previous track, but doesn't pull me in as effectively. The deep bass lines and percussion patterns that start and stop and seem to shift between halftime and double time every now and then are plenty driving, but they're also joined by a lot of overbearing breathing and gasping noises, which, not really crazy about. As well as lots of weird vocal snippets that show up every now and then, which, okay, whatever. Crystal Garden is another track that I was less engaged by, but I guess I still thought was quite cool. A much more ambient-centric cut, on average, that cycles between various layers of glittering synth arpeggios and effects and eventually paying off into this kind of glitchy synth riff that's able to build a bit more of a groove to fit in with everything else, and eventually just kind of built up into the usual mix of techno percussion. Honestly, kind of wish this track actually had less percussion than it did to allow it to stand better on its own, but yeah, again, still pretty cool, I guess. And the album ends in its single two most hardest hitting and driving moments of all. You of course got the lead single Brutalism, which is especially heavy and industrial flavored, surrounding banging techno beats and descending bass riffs with lots of strange distortion artifacts and hissing noises, introducing more driving bass lines, some of which kind of remind me of sample loops I feel like I've come across before when making my own music, but flipped around in a creative ways still. There's sections that have much more of that overt EDM flavor too, and just have fairly normal, if dark and menacing lead synth melodies going over standard dance beats, but they're more acting as isolated payoffs to build-ups of more strange evolving ambience in between. The breathing sound effects I didn't really like on Zeitgeist also come back here, but they're not quite as openly present as they were on that track, and this track's sense of epicness is able to drown that mild complaint out. And finally, the album closes with EPICA, quite possibly the most normal techno cut out of everything here, mainly built around all these dramatic choir sounds getting rapidly chopped up, going over steadily building bassy percussion that pay off in fittingly epic ways. Occasionally also some really menacing and chilling bassy ambient sections as well that fit just as seamlessly into the overall sense of build-up created by everything else. There are still moments that feel like they might be going off track a bit, but once again they always snap right back before anything can get fully derailed. It's admittedly not the kind of track that would have immediately stuck out to me as a closer, perhaps more of like a penultimate track climax. And it does end really abruptly too, but you know, it still goes pretty dang hard and I can't complain about it on its own. So that's everything on Oxymore, and even when I outline everything that happens in this album, I have a hard time wrapping my head around it. I think at the end of the day, I eventually settled on this album being very good, if not quite great, or standing among my absolute favorites from him. Obviously, the sound design is absolutely stunning and operates on a level of detail I'm once again not used to out of Jarre in particular. There's lots of driving grooves and cool ideas all over the place, and I do really have to give him special credit for how daring it is for him to present all these ideas in such an intentionally confusing way. Again, it is kind of mind-blowing that we got an album like this from him in 2022, and I do think he really succeeded in getting it to sound really futuristic and cutting edge. But I was still left at the end of all of it feeling emotionally distant. It was all the kind of thing that I could really respect and was fun to gawk at, but would always be difficult for me to feel like I was grounding myself. And it could too often run together in an incoherent blur. It was absolutely a fun listen and mind-blowing in the short term, but not the kind of thing that left me really wanting to come back for more, I guess. I think I'd put this in the same tier of enjoyment as albums of his like Rendezvous and Waiting for Cousteau. Moments in his catalog that do feel really special in their own ways, but are maybe missing some extra factor for them to quite reach the heights of my biggest favorites in his catalog. I'm thinking it's in between those two albums. I like it more than Rendezvous, but less than Waiting for Cousteau. That's about where it's in my ranking. So, I guess take that all as you will. It's not going to mark as one of my favorites of the year, but it was absolutely an interesting experience that's definitely worth hearing at least once. And again, I can't complain about getting so damn weird and boundary pushing out of a 74-year-old artist who's still trying his best to stay ahead of the curve or at least keep up with it, and mostly succeeding at it. I don't love it, but it is something special, and I can give it a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.